No one hurt, no one any the wiser. One of the all-time great escapes from a major prison, and I'm talking Pentridge here.
He escaped from Grafton, which was the prison you couldn't escape from. And he ended up becoming quite a media celebrity.
The police had basically drip-fed information about Jockey Smith to the media, who started calling him public enemy number 1. Incidentally, Ray Denning was public enemy number 2.
This is the story of Edward James Jockey Smith, public enemy number 1. And Raymond John Denning, an unlikely campaigner for prison reform who then turned into a supergrass. They were violent armed robbers who had the dash and cunning to escape from prison. In this episode of Suburban Gangsters, we meet two famous fugitives, remembered more for escaping prison than any of their crimes. Ray Denning got out of Grafton jail in a rubbish skip. And Edward Jockey Smith casually walked out of the front gates of Pentridge Prison. Smith was known for his cunning and reaching for a gun if ever cornered.
I don't have any doubt in my mind that I would have been shot and killed that night. And it was only by a bystander's involvement that enabled me to reach for my firearm, and the shots I fired were fatal.
A lone policeman had ordered him to pull over, and then an exchange of shots. His body was left on the road for several hours as police determined exactly what happened. Ironically, Smith was killed less than 100 kilometres from where he was born in 1942.
Edward James Smith, known to his friends as Jimmy or Jockey, came to a violent end on a country road. Yet there was nothing in Smith's background that could have foretold his dismal end.
Jimmy Smith started off as, just a pretty typical kid in a poor family, a struggling family. The biggest thing about Jimmy Smith was that he was a promising jockey. He actually won quite a few races in his earlier day, and he started off working for local trainers around Geelong, and he got a fair bit of work.
The racing industry had long exploited young jockeys like Jimmy Smith.
There was one deal where we were supposed to get something like £5 a week and the use of a car with petrol, and that worked for a couple of weeks. Finally, the trainer said, "Well, stuff you, jockey. You can work for the petrol in the car. You're not getting any other money, you're getting food here, that's enough." And Jockey probably thought, well, that ain't good enough.
His career as an apprentice jockey didn't last very long. He was very soon getting involved with garage break and steal, shop break and steal, and then he was doing time in prison.
It was in prison at 19 years of age that Jockey met his criminal mentor, Ronald Ryan, an experienced armed robber who was then in his late 30s. Ryan took the young kid under his wing, and the two formed a bond that continued long after their release.
Jimmy Smith and Ronald Ryan became firm friends, so much so that they were very close to each other, their families were friends. I suspect that Ronald Ryan was Jimmy Smith's tutor in crime, and Jimmy Smith respected him enormously. He looked up to him.
Under Ryan's tutelage, Jockey progressed to armed robbery, and the two men pulled a number of jobs together, one of which Jockey did time for. In 1965, while serving a 9-year sentence for another armed robbery, Ryan made headlines when he and another inmate escaped from Pentridge Prison. During the escape, one of the guards, George Hodson, was fatally shot.
The already massive manhunt intensifies. Squads of heavily armed police carry out a series of raids across Melbourne. By now, a frightened city. That fear is heightened by the message the media is spreading.
Police are warning the public not to approach Ronald Ryan and Peter Walker, who are armed and dangerous. It is believed that the two men have fled to Sydney.
Ryan and Walker escaped from Pentridge, and of course the heat was on Sydney to bring about their arrest. Information was that they were here.
Just 17 days after their escape, Ryan and Walker were back in custody and were later tried for murder. Walker got 12 years for manslaughter, while Ryan was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang.
There was a lot of opposition to his hanging. It was a political hanging, many people think. Henry Bolte, who was the Premier of Victoria at that particular time, was facing re-election, and he wanted to make a tough stance on behalf of police and on behalf of the community and say, right, we're not going to tolerate any of this sort of stuff.
There was a public outcry over Ryan's death sentence as doubts about his guilt grew. The defence claimed the trajectory of the fatal bullet showed that Hodson could have been accidentally shot by another guard trying to stop the escape.
The Cabinet is satisfied that there are no reasons why the sentence pronounced by the court should not be carried out. The sentence of death will be carried out at 8 a.m. on Friday, the 3rd of February 1967.
Jockey Smith was distraught and decided to take drastic action to save his mentor. He and a few associates planned a jailbreak.
They were going to use gelignite to brazen their way through the wall of Pentridge, and from there on they were going to use automatic weapons, and I guess the idea would have been shoot all comers. It was all set to go. Word was got to Ronald Ryan that this was going to happen, and he was the one who put the kibosh on it. He got the message to get to Jockey Smith, basically saying, under no circumstances are you to attempt to free me. He's basically told Smith that he doesn't want any further bloodshed caused at his expense.
Ronald Ryan was hanged inside Pentridge Prison at 8 o'clock this morning. It follows a long and tumultuous campaign to commute his death sentence.
Ryan's death should have deterred his young apprentice from a life of crime. But Jockey was fearless and became even more brazen. Within the year, he was sent to Pentridge for armed robbery. Jockey Smith's first foray into thieving had more to do with teenage recklessness than necessity. The same could not be said for Ray Denning, who was homeless at 13 after he saw his mother deliberately burn herself to death to escape her husband's beatings.
Denning came from a very violent family. His father was a brutal, hard-nosed criminal who spent a lot of time in jail anyway, and as a consequence, he was left without a father as a guiding figure. He was also a witness to his mother committing suicide in front of his eyes. She was just so thoroughly exhausted by the brutal life she lived with her husband, and the thought of him coming back home again after jail was just too much, so she set herself on fire.
Some years later, his sister Charmaine recalled that fateful day.
We was just nearly asleep when we heard this screaming. It was terrible, and screaming and screaming. We both jumped up. Mum was fully alight. There was nothing left of her that wasn't alight. She was rolling on the floor and she set the little flat on fire. We couldn't get out at the time because the key was lost. Raymond was the one who eventually found the key for us to get out of, sort of thing. He kept holding me back saying, don't go near the fire, don't get burnt too, don't get burnt too, sort of thing.
Ray and Charmaine were separated after their mother's death, and he was sent to live with relatives. Denning was traumatised and unhappy and soon ran away. He lived on the streets and stole to survive.
He would have spent most of his childhood with nothing to lose because it's all gone. And so it's not any surprise that he gets into serious crime because there's nothing to stop him.
Denning was just 18 when he was caught for armed robbery, a particularly heavy crime for someone his age. By 21, he was convicted of a string of armed robberies and sentenced to 13 years in Parramatta Jail.
It was absolutely driven by the screws and their hatred of the maggots, as they used to refer to the prisoners there. Very, very violent. And it was never controlled in any way by the prison officers, other than them pointing guns at you from their towers at muster. But other than that, the more blood that was spilt on the circle, the happier they felt. And that's what sort of institution Parramatta was.
Denning was familiar with violence and cruelty, but nothing could prepare him for prison life. Early on, he'd called on guards to stop beating another prisoner and was bashed by 6 of them for his insolence. His card was now marked, and he was targeted for regular beatings. Denning was desperate to escape.
The 3 other inmates that Denning had intended escaping with were probably all heavier crooks than Denning, and I think would have been surprised and appalled at Denning's reaction that day. I don't think anyone else envisaged bashing someone half to death to get out of jail.
A prison guard named Willie Faber tried to prevent the escape. So Denning opened up his skull with a claw hammer.
The assault on Willie Faber, as well as being outrageously violent, was completely unnecessary in the context of Denning and his fellow inmates' attempt to escape. There was just absolutely no need for that prison officer to be bashed the way he was. The initial first aid Willie Faber received that day was from another inmate, a prison medical officer, who was Arthur Stanley Neddy Smith.
Neddy Smith was a drug dealer and armed robber. He would later become one of Sydney's most feared gangsters.
He was certain Officer Faber would not live as he put the man's brains back in his skull, and the fact of the matter is that Willie Faber lived for another 4 sick, terrible years.
Denning was charged with malicious injury and attempting to escape. Faber could not initially identify his attacker. He later said it was Denning, but in the witness box, Faber admitted the police had told him that Denning was the culprit. The Crown's case rested on an unsigned record of interview, which Denning denied ever giving. He was sentenced to life in prison.
That's the only charge he ever denied. And he was charged with many offences, many armed robberies over a 10, 20-year period. He pleaded guilty to every single charge except that one. I think he had one alibi, but the only alibi he had available was, in fact, Neddy Smith, and his lawyers at the time didn't think that would be awfully good as an alibi.
The attack on a prison guard meant Denning was headed for Grafton Jail, where the state's most dangerous prisoners were housed.
In Grafton Tracks, which was short for intractables or difficult prisoners, you started off with a reception biff, sometimes known as the Jacaranda Festival, where you got beaten senseless as an introduction. It only eased up after a few weeks, and then it never got better.
News of the attack on Faber preceded him, and Denning was hit harder than most. He was later transferred to Katingal, the Supermax wing of Long Bay Jail, which was dubbed the electronic zoo.
He described that as a very inhuman experience, and Katingal had a method by which it was not just solitary confinement, but where even your meals would be given to you on a mechanised plate. You would have no contact even with your prison warders.
Prisoners were confined to tiny cells with no natural daylight or fresh air. Conditions were so inhumane, Katingal was eventually closed, and Denning was transferred to Maitland Prison. He began work on his next escape.
In 1977, Denning and 6 others, all armed robbers, escaped from Maitland Jail, a maximum security prison. Going out through a new shower block in the prison, down over the wall, and then off into the suburbs and countryside. While it was some feat to get out of that jail, which is effectively a big stone box, not much thought had gone into what they were going to do once they got over the wall.
The prisoners were all caught within 4 hours. With 2 prison breaks behind him, Denning was a serial escapee, and authorities singled him out for special treatment. In 1972, Jockey Smith was coming to the end of a 5-year sentence for armed robbery. He'd survived the rigours of Pentridge Prison and never lost his sense of humour.
Jockey was one of those guys who had more front than Myers. Very charismatic, very, very likeable. I'd be surprised if he ever had a physical confrontation in all the time he was in prison, except down in H Division, where everyone had physical confrontations. He was the guy in prison who you gave your transcripts to look at to see if he could come up with anything that no one had thought of. He was a good jailhouse lawyer.
Like Denning, Jockey stood up for prisoners' rights and was elected by his peers to be a prisoner representative. Most prisoners had little knowledge of their rights, but Jockey made a point of being informed. He and Ray Mooney would bring prisoner complaints to the governor, Ian Grindlay.
At that time, books on criminal law were illegal in prisons. You weren't allowed to have access to to anything to do with the criminal law. But I was able to get hold of the prison regulations where I worked, and I secretly photocopied them, and I'd got Jockey Smith a copy of them, because he'd asked me if I could get him a copy. So at one of these prisoners' representative meetings, Jockey pulls out the prison regulations, and Grindlay knew he has a heart attack, but he doesn't say anything, and Jockey's looking at the food that each prisoner is entitled to per day and per week. And he's quoting off and saying, we're entitled to a piece of fruit a week. Well, where's our fucking fruit? We're entitled to, and on he goes. Grindlay says, give us that. Reads it, and he's right. Jockey's right. All the food we're entitled to, we're probably getting about half of it. And Grindlay looks at it, and he thinks for about 30 seconds, hands it back and says, yeah, you're right, Jockey. He says, but show me there where it says I've got to cook it.
Less than 2 years after he'd walked free from Pentridge, Jockey was back for armed robbery. 8 days later, he escaped.
The story goes that he's pulled up one of the visitors who looked a little bit of a knockabout type of a guy and said, look, oh, I've lost my pass. And I'm in a hurry. Any chance I can grab yours? And you just mentioned it when you go through that you lost your pass. It won't be a problem. You'll be able to go out. And got hold of the pass, walked straight up to where they took the passes and let the visitors back out, handed the pass in and walked out. No one hurt. No one any the wiser. One of the all-time great escapes from a maximum security prison in Melbourne, and naturally as a result of that, Jockey went into cult status.
In relation to Jockey Smith's escape, the thing that you have to realise is that he's a remand prisoner. Jockey's awaiting trial, and so he's in his civilian clothes, and so is everyone else in the remand section. So when he jumps the fence and gets into the visitors section, he doesn't necessarily look out of place. He's just in the clothes he was arrested in.
He fled to Sydney, where he rendezvoused with Valerie Hill, a woman he'd married while in prison. The two hid in a rural community in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. Jockey changed his appearance and assumed a new life training horses. But robbery was much more lucrative, and Jockey lived a double life. His alter ego was always armed and dangerous.
In 1977, the CBA Bank, as it was then known, at South Hurstville was held up. There were 3 offenders, and they got away with about $180,000, which was then Australia's largest bank armed robbery. Very shortly after that, a off-duty security officer challenged the offenders, and I've very good reason to believe that it was Jockey Smith discharged a shot at the security officer, which struck a telegraph pole nearby. They got away.
Jockey was wanted for attempted murder, armed robbery and escaping prison. He and Hill fled further south to the coastal town of Nowra. Here, Jockey would be accused of his worst crime, the murder of a respected bookmaker, Lloyd Tidmarsh.
Smith and 2 accomplices broke into Tidmarsh's home on Monday night of the June long weekend 1977, believing his safe to be full of cash after a big day at Randwick races. Tidmarsh and his 16-year-old son Michael were ordered to lie face down on the floor, while wife Irene and daughter Michelle remained in their bedrooms upstairs. When father and son both denied existence of safe or cash, a struggle developed during which Tidmarsh was shot 4 times, once through the heart. Crown's case relied on evidence from Tidmarsh's daughter, Michelle, who identified Smith's voice as belonging to one of the intruders.
What about the police verbal? Something about that?
Jockey was given 3 life sentences. He was set to end his days in Katingal, the electronic zoo. Meanwhile, fellow escapee Ray Denning was sent back to Grafton Jail after his botched escape from Maitland Prison.
Grafton Jail existed as a place of last resort punishment. If you mucked up in another New South Wales prison, you were shanghaied to Grafton. Most people didn't go back a second time.
Grafton, second only to Katingal, was the worst jail Ray went to, according to him. He was bashed regularly on his account by prison officers.
In Grafton, Denning joined a prisoners' action group. Perhaps he'd resigned himself to his life sentence and wanted to improve conditions.
Well, how we came to first coming to contact with Ray Denning was he was an activist for the prisoners' action group inside Grafton Jail, and Grafton was just famous for the awfulness of the jail and the way in which the prisoners were treated. He claimed to have been in prison for a fabricated confession, and we were running a campaign against police verbals at the time.
I have mixed feelings about the prisoners' action group. He seemed to be not their whipping boy, but their sacrificial lamb, in the sense that if the prisoners' action group outside jail wanted Ray to do something, Ray would do it. But they were never around for the bashings. And Ray copped a lot of flack in jail for being associated with the prisoners' action group.
Denning wrote of the constant beatings and humiliation in a diary which was circulated amongst prisoner action groups.
Denning gave the first, as far as I know, the first accurate descriptions of what went on inside a lot of the grimmer prisons in New South Wales. He knew Grafton, and He knew the intractables in Grafton, so he was sort of kind of placed at a position where he could blow that apart, and he did.
Denning's diary was smuggled out of prison and published as part of a push to close Grafton Jail. In April 1980, Denning reached his breaking point and once again put his life on the line to escape prison.
Well, Ray Denning is the only man to escape from Grafton Jail in the 100-year history of the prison. He escaped with the assistance of other inmates. He was put in a rubbish skip. Part of the daily duties for some of the prisoners was to basically take a rubbish skip out through the prison gates to an incinerator which was just outside.
The way he told it was that there was a 1 in 3 chance that the incinerator in Grafton Jail would be lit on any given day. He took that risk, got himself tipped into the incinerator and walked out the other side after developing a firm view that his life was just going to end in Grafton Jail.
He remained on the run for 18 months and became a celebrated figure among prison reform activists. Being on Australia's most wanted list gave Denning an opportunity to expose prisoner abuse through recordings he sent to the media.
At least 99% of the prisoners in jail at the moment, they're not looking for any sympathy at all. All they're looking for is what is known as a bit of equality. Just because you come to jail shouldn't mean that you've got to be treated like garbage or treated like an animal. How is a prison officer's boot or fist or baton going to help a prisoner in any way whatsoever at all get back into society and treat society with any respect?
Denning had embarrassed the authorities. He knew exactly what would be waiting for him if he was ever caught and returned to jail. Ray Denning's high-profile media campaign for prison reform attracted a wave of public support while he was on the run.
I've left it in the public's hands, meaning, well, your hands, as to whether you think that I should give myself up or not, or whether the public feel that I shouldn't give myself up until I'm given a guarantee that there will be at least an inquiry into my allegations.
Denning was recaptured in November 1981 after 20 months at large. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and sent to Goulburn Jail, which was now regarded as worse than Katingal. However, just 1 month later, the trial judge mysteriously quashed his sentence. Speculation was rife that Denning had struck some kind of deal.
Strangely enough, while he's in prison for that 5-year period, there's no complaints about how he's treated. There's no complaints about his mail being open. There's no complaints about how he's, managed by the prison system.
Denning was transferred to minimum security, where he enjoyed greater freedom and privilege within the prison walls. A few months later, he jumped the fence and was on the run again.
Denning was only on the run for a week after he broke out of Goulburn Jail, but it was enough time for him to link up with an old criminal mate from the past, Russell Cox. Amazingly, Cox had been on the run for 11 years. For more than a decade, the police couldn't find him. Denning found him in a week. Maybe he should have joined the force.
Denning and Cox planned an armed robbery, but they were seen following their target, an armoured payroll van.
Along with Russell Cox, who'd been on the run for more than 10 years, Denning was caught after a shootout with police in a Melbourne shopping centre.
Police intercepted Denning's car and found 2 sawn-off .22 rifles and balaclavas. But Cox, after seeing the police, tried to escape through the car park. It was only after Cox was taken to CIB headquarters that police realised the significance of the arrest, and they were delighted.
He's a person that we believe has been involved in some very vicious criminal activities.
Cox had also embarrassed the authorities for over a decade. His capture was a major victory. Rumours were rife that Denning had agreed to deliver Russell Cox to police in exchange for parole.
He was been bashing his head up against a brick wall against the New South Wales prison system for years. He became a legend as a result of doing this. And no one expected him to turn dog. No one. Least of all bloody Russell Cox. No one expected Denning to turn dog. Ray Denning turned dog. Unbelievable.
I think the decision was made early to become an informer. I think even then he was particular about who he informed on. When he finally got captured with Russell Cox and they started lining him up with the robberies in Queensland, robberies in Victoria, the remainder of his life sentence in New South Wales, I think then it became an overwhelming burden to him. And I suspect he would have put his hands up for anyone he thought he had information on. This made him highly desirable.
Ray Denning, the supergrass, was just getting started.
He was a very likeable, charismatic person, and strangely enough had a very high-pitched, squeaky voice. The opposite of what you would think was public enemy number one.
What about the police verbal? About that.
Tidmarsh's daughter testified she recognised Jockey Smith's distinctive voice. Her testimony was crucial in convicting Smith for her father's murder.
How she did that was that police took her to a court where Jimmy Smith was at that particular moment representing himself on another charge. And the police took her into the back of the court and said, "Can you identify anybody in this room whose voice you recognise?" Well, it's a really interesting way of policing, because if you think about it, the obvious inference is, can you identify the person up the front who is representing himself in court? And she did. She identified Jockey Smith as the person, as the voice she heard in her house the night her father was murdered. Smith was subsequently charged with Lloyd Tidmarsh's murder.
There was a lot of reasons to think he was given a very bad deal, a very, very raw deal. I found it difficult to believe that he would have shot him. I found that really difficult to believe. It just didn't seem to be in his nature.
Smith strongly protested his innocence, and as a self-taught lawyer, he appealed his conviction.
The evidence, she did not see, it must be remembered, she did not see who was there. These were 3 masked gunmen, and she only heard the voice. And in the end, on appeal, that evidence wasn't accepted, and Jockey Smith was acquitted of the murder of Lloyd Tidmarsh.
Jockey finally succeeded in getting his murder conviction overturned after years in court, but he still had other crimes to serve time for. He eventually walked free in 1992, but just one day later, an issue on the domestic front threatened his life.
The notorious Jockey Smith walked from Silverwater Jail on Wednesday after 15 years in custody. That newfound freedom almost costing him his life. He and his wife were ambushed as they arrived at their ground floor flat in Curlewis Street. 49-year-old Smith racing upstairs trying to escape the hail of bullets.
He was critically injured. Val was screaming. Jockey Smith was scampering. You could imagine a guy taking 5 shots. He was scampering as best he could, blood leaking out of his body, up the steps trying to get away.
Jockey never identified the gunman, but it's believed it was a jealous former boyfriend of his wife. Jockey recovered but went to ground. Shortly after, he was back in trouble, this time with the law.
Late yesterday afternoon, security guards at Grace Brothers Erina questioned a man suspected of shoplifting. He challenged them with a revolver, threatening the life of one of the officers, then ran to a nearby car, ordering a man and his wife to drive him down the road.
Effectively, by the time he leaves there, he's turned shoplifting, a simple shoplifting offence, into kidnapping, threatening to kill, steal motor vehicle. I mean, the man's a lunatic.
The next time Jockey pulled a gun, it would be his last.
On at least 6 occasions, he pulled guns on police or citizens in order to escape, in order to avoid capture, in order to avoid getting rumbled. I mean, this is just something he did. He was a small man by stature. He didn't fight. He wasn't physically imposing. So when he was in trouble, he reached for a gun.
Once more, Jockey was on the run. He headed interstate to Victoria, where he laid low for a few weeks. One evening, under the cover of darkness, he cautiously drove to the nearby town of Daylesford. Little did he know that driving cautiously would trigger a catastrophic event.
Notorious criminal Edward Jockey Smith has been shot dead by Victorian police. The man, once called Australia's most wanted, ended his life in a shootout while on the run. Smith's criminal career was brought to an end by a routine police check on a stolen car.
I was patrolling out of a town called Newlyn, which is between Ballarat and Daylesford. I saw a car ahead of me. It was only travelling about 80 in the 100 zone, so I radioed to Ballarat Communications Centre a car check on the registration plate, and the radio operator came out and said it was a stolen car.
A routine number plate check by a lone policeman showed the car Smith was driving to be stolen. The officer tailed Smith to the driveway of a hotel bottle shop.
The driver of the car approached me with his right hand hidden behind a folder, like a car document folder. He dropped the folder and I saw a small firearm in. The male with the firearm raised it at my head. I said, "I'm going to kill you."
A passing motorist saw what was happening and attempted to run Smith down.
I seized the moment, reached and grabbed my firearm, aimed it from the hip and fired 2 shots.
The fugitive fired twice towards the driver, but was then gunned down by the police officer. He was hit twice in the chest, dying almost immediately.
I don't have any doubt in my mind that I would have been shot and killed that night. And it was only by a bystander's involvement that distracted him, enabled me to reach for my firearm, and the shots I fired were fatal.
I never saw Jockey as a violent person, and I could understand him getting into a situation where before he knows it, his back's to the wall, and there's another heap of charges fronting him, and as we know the history of what happened with Jockey, that's basically what happened. He finished up getting killed for that very reason.
Jockey Smith was simply a thug to police, but his death was mourned by hundreds of his mates who knew another side to him. For all that Ray Denning did for prisoner rights, he too should have been mourned, but he would depart this world as a hated and despised figure. It's long been said that Denning had assisted police to bring Russell Cox to justice. That's never been proven. But there's no doubt that on his return to jail, Denning secured preferential treatment, and then his career as a supergrass began in earnest.
I've always taken a stand on what I believe in, and I was 100% against authority and the system at one stage. And then, like I said, once that tunnel vision, I lost that tunnel vision, I jerried that justice works for everybody, not just for the one side, and that I was prepared to stand up and be counted and inform on other prisoners that I believed had done the wrong thing, and to give the victims a chance for once.
He should have known better. He really should have known better, because he did run with a lot of heavyweight guys, and he did a lot of heavyweight things, and to roll over like that, it's just despicable.
The next big scalp Denning offered up was Tim Anderson, the alleged Hilton bomber.
The prosecution tendered 2 statements made to police by Raymond John Denning. Denning, who was recaptured in Victoria last year, described Tim Anderson as a close friend, with whom he'd had hundreds of conversations in jail. Denning told police, "There is no doubt at all in my mind that he said that he was the person who planted the bomb that exploded at the Hilton Hotel." It was these statements that gave police cause to reopen the Hilton case and charge Anderson.
From that moment on, he was just a piece. He was just a protective custody type of person, and I don't know how he ever lived with himself. And the fact that all this information was leaked by him to authorities, and such serious allegations, you know, getting people 10 years, 8 years in jail, and they didn't do it just for reward, I mean, it stinks.
Anderson was convicted of the crime, largely on Denning's evidence, but was later acquitted on appeal. After 5 years of informing, Denning expected to be rewarded with parole.
The judge, too, was sympathetic, Justice Wood saying much of Ray Denning's long life of crime must be blamed on the jail system itself. But he accepted that Denning was a new man and ordered he be eligible for parole in late November. Upon release, Denning will be given a new identity and join the Witness Protection Unit. Denning said he was happy with today's decision, but he has no illusions about life outside. Now that he's helping police, he says he'll be watching his back forever.
At about that time, however, there was political pressure about him being on the Witness Protection Program, which costs a lot of money. And there was some flack going around that state government money and the taxpayers' money was being used to protect this criminal, in response to which they dropped him from the program, just about as he was being released. So he had this terrible situation in which he had a new identity and a new bank account, but he hadn't yet got his ID, so he couldn't access those things. So he was basically left to dry by the state government with no resources at all and none of the identity protection that he'd been promised to save him from the underworld he'd informed on.
How do you feel, Ray? Good.
At 2:30 this morning, ambulance officers were called to a terrace house. They found Denning dead.
Ambulance officers attended and initial indications are that the man Denning collapsed. There are no suspicious circumstances. However, police say they are in the early stages of their inquiry and investigations are continuing.
Denning died of a heroin overdose, but the circumstances were suspicious.
There were needle marks found in Ray, but in his back. Nowhere where anyone would normally inject drugs.
Many still believe his death was murder, a hot shot of heroin delivered by the underworld to silence the supergrass once and for all.
We still don't know whether we did the right thing, seeking to get him out of jail, particularly after he was dropped from the Witness Protection Program. We comfort ourselves with the fact that he probably had a great time in the 6 weeks that he was genuinely free. Other than that, though, it's a tragic loss of life. Someone who I think might have been able to rehabilitate himself in the right company.
Two violent criminals running from justice and meeting a predictable end. If ever there was a pair of crooks whose lives exemplify the perils of crime, it's Ray Denning and Jockey Smith. One may be celebrated and the other reviled, but really, There's nothing redeeming in either one.